I want to lead my party because I think it's the best vehicle for the hopes and dreams of the British people to be made into reality, into the kind of policies that actually deliver.
It's almost impossible for the Tories to say anything about the NHS without being accused of wanting to close it down.
Well, I think when the Prime Minister isn't shopping on Savile Row, going to football matches and Taylor Swift concerts, Downing Street itself seems quite shambolic.
There is growing alarm out there at the idea of betting on growth to try and make the public finances add up.
We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast, ordinarily with me, Liam Halligan, and Alison Pearson. But this week, the honorary co-pilot, she's wandered off again. She's ventured to Israel, doing some on-the-ground reporting, but she'll be back next week, writing and reflecting on her visit. And in the meantime, I'm delighted to be joined by Telegraph columnist and now the newly minted Tory MP for West Suffolk, Nick Timothy. Nick, you've co-hosted Planet Normal in the past. You're an avid listener. Great to have you with us.
Hello, it's great to be back.
Now, junior doctors across the NHS, which will now be called resident doctors, have been handed a taxpayer-funded 22% pay rise over 2 years, after almost 2 years of strikes, which have brought the NHS to its knees. Doctors in England have taken industrial action 11 times in the past 22 months, their last strike just days before the general election. NHS waiting lists have meanwhile almost doubled from 4 to 8 million since before the COVID pandemic, with almost half of patients waiting for 18 weeks or more. Some say junior doctors routinely work themselves to a standstill in unpaid overtime. Others complain about the difficulty of getting an in-person GP appointment, point out that many NHS doctors routinely top up their salaries with private sector work, and bemoan long A&E waiting times. Over 1.5 million patients in England had to wait 12 hours or longer in A&E over the last year. That's 1 in 10. That's more than 4,000 people per day. Can the NHS reform? Will the NHS reform? Or will we just keep pouring money into a bloated, inefficient system that produces some of the worst health outcomes in the Western world? And even as the pay award is announced, junior doctors are warning they will strike again if future demands aren't met. Since Labour entered government 10 weeks ago, Nick, you've been settling in as a new MP, although you're no stranger to Westminster, as you were, of course, Downing Street's Joint Chief of Staff in Theresa May's government. One subject you focused on is immigration, in particular, changes Labour has quietly made to the asylum system, which Home Secretary Yvette Cooper claims will save the UK money, but you argue otherwise. And of course, there's growing speculation across the country about what might and might not appear in Chancellor Rachel Reeves's first budget on the 30th of October, by which time the Tories still won't have a leader, almost 4 months on from that general election defeat back in early July. Great to have you with us, Nick. And before we start, briefly, having served at the very top of government, what's it like being a humble opposition MP?
Well, they're completely different jobs. And I've noticed since I arrived in Westminster, since the general election, quite a lot of people have said, it must be very much the same for you and the start must be quite easy. But it's not like that at all. They're very different. And there's lots about Parliament that you don't know until you're elected, like silly things like I didn't know where the MP's tea room was and the number of times you open doors on the corridors and find you're trying to walk into a cupboard rather than the place you think you're going to.
Have you got an office yet? Because new MPs famously have to scramble around for offices.
Yeah, I didn't have an office until we came back from the summer recess. So I got my office in September. It's the size of a postage stamp. So now I'm begging and borrowing and stealing space for my team. So I'm in the process of setting up my team and they don't have anywhere to work from at the moment.
A long way from number 10.
It's very different. But
at least for now, I was going to say.
No, you get to help people in a really direct way in the constituency, which is really great, actually.
And it's a lovely part of the country, of course, that you represent there in West Suffolk.
It is, and the sun's just come out, which is very nice.
Nick, you've been knocking around the top of politics for a long time. You've been a major voice when it comes to public policy, again, over many years. A voice that continues to be heard, not just in Parliament, but of course in the Telegraph. NHS reform. Wes Streeting, Health Secretary, he's making the right rhetorical noises. Even Keir Starmer's making the right rhetorical noises. What's going to happen?
Well, we don't know, do we? I mean, Wes Streeting, as you say, talks a good game about reform, but the one thing he's done so far is to give this 22% pay rise to junior doctors, backdated to include the period when they were on strike. And he hasn't sought to link it to reform at all, which strikes me as being quite a serious error and quite naive on his part. You know, if Labour are interested in proper NHS reform, then I think we as Conservatives should listen to that and support it where we think it's right. But at the moment, we've only really had rhetoric and the typical Labour response to a problem, which is to throw money at it and to listen to the trade unions.
Why is it so intractable? Why, Nick, despite the fact that many members of the public refer to the NHS as the best in the world, we actually have some terrible health outcomes. We're at the bottom of the OECD League of Advanced Countries, or very near the bottom when it comes to health outcomes for the big three: stroke, heart disease, and oncology. Why have we got to this point where we've got 8 million people on a waiting list? Why have we got to this point where, despite really being at the cutting edge of so many aspects of medicine, UK voters experience routinely, day to day, some terrible service from the NHS alongside a lot of good service?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of things you can point to explain why things have felt difficult recently. So there's this slow burn of our ageing society and how that gradually increases demand for social care, which has knock-on effects for the NHS, for the demand for various different treatments. There's health sector inflation. There's been the issue with pay and the strikes. And obviously, we just stopped treating non-emergency COVID cases during the pandemic. So there's a backlog there as well. And you know, we obviously have some brilliant doctors and nurses, and there are parts of the NHS that work really well, but it's not true to say it's the best in the world. And we should have some very honest conversations about that and try to work out how we can, make it the best in the world and to make sure we get back what we put in. I think part of the problem is, obviously, it's this absolutely enormous monolith, and the reforms introduced under the coalition government made NHS England completely separate from the Department of Health, and it became completely unaccountable. And if you're the NHS England chief executive and you're accountable for everything, that really means in a system of that size, you're accountable for nothing. And I think we have spent a lot of time as a country trying to introduce lots of market forces into a national system. And it's my view that, broadly speaking, you can have a national system, which is what we've had since just after the war. You can have a market system, as they do in Europe, and they have pretty good outcomes there. But there is a limit beyond which you can't go in terms of trying to marketize a national system. So the internal market reforms of the 80s and 90s, where we put standardized pricing on things and created pricing incentives for certain services and treatments, which were then accelerated under Tony Blair in the early 2000s. Those worked, but if you go beyond that and you try to create the kind of complicated commissioning models that we tried to create in the 2010s, I think all that really does is generate lots of bureaucracy and doesn't create the market forces that the decision makers had hoped.
Do you think there'll be any coming together among the main parties to try and sort out the NHS? It's clear that the system is creaking badly at the edges. I mentioned almost 8 million people on a waiting list. So many healthcare professionals have emailed Alison and I at Plant Normal, at telegraph.co.uk, telling us that actually there are waiting lists to get on waiting lists to get on waiting lists. And the reality on the ground is that there are much more than almost 8 million people waiting for NHS treatment. As I say, half of them waiting for 18 weeks or more. But it's still seen as a political football. I think a lot of people in politics and looking on from outside would say it's almost impossible for the Tories to say anything about the NHS without being accused of wanting to close it down. Now, Labour are saying in the form of Streeting and Starmer that they don't want to put any more money in unless there is reform. But as you say, they said that straight after they'd just given the junior doctors a big pay rise without any terms and conditions, ostensibly, in terms of how they conduct their work.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the kind of reform that Labour put forward. I mean, one of the things that Streeting has floated in the past is effectively nationalising GP services, because the GP services are part of the system that weren't nationalised in the 40s. I think that would be a mistake. I mean, I think part of the problem with the NHS is its sheer size, and we've got to try to work out how we create the kind of organizational structures that mean that you do get the economies of scale, but you also get proper accountability and leadership on a scale that actually works. And nationalizing things more and making it bigger and bigger, I think, is the wrong approach. I mean, the Conservative candidates have, I think, at different points said, well, if Labour come forward with sensible reforms, then we will support that. And I think that's the right kind of approach to opposition. Be constructive where you can, be tough in your scrutiny and stand up to them where necessary. But as for whether the Conservatives can ever reform the NHS, I think this is part of the problem that the party has had for some years now. The NHS has actually been under Conservative stewardship for, I think, more than 2/3 of its history. And the idea that we're always secretly conniving to abolish it is obviously ridiculous, because we'd have done it if that had ever been the intent by now. The Conservatives are committed to the principles of the NHS, and we should be unafraid about bringing the principles that we believe in to reform of the NHS in future. And doing nothing when you know that things are deteriorating is a decision. And we can't afford to be in that kind of position ever again. And the party, I think, needs to regain its intellectual self-confidence. I mean, just generally beyond the NHS, I think we need to rediscover what real conservatism is. I don't mean by that be more right-wing necessarily, maybe more right-wing on the odd thing, it might not be on another. But the true principles of kind of intellectual conservatism are completely sound, and we need to get back to them and build up again from first principles. And if we believe that a public service, and the NHS is easily the biggest public service, is in need of reform, then we should be prepared to make that argument and to do it.
Nick, in the dog days of summer back in late August, you wrote a column for The Telegraph. I exposed Yvette Cooper's shameful immigration lie. Yvette Cooper, of course, is the new Home Secretary. Pretty strong language from you. In my experience, you are a man who chooses his words very, very carefully, and yet you were writing there in no uncertain terms. And of course, we'll put the link to that column in the show notes to this episode. You were talking about a change that the Home Secretary made just before the House of Commons rose for its summer recess, and you were writing a column in the middle of summer as well. That's why I wanted to return to this subject, because when I read that column, it really struck me that you were pretty riled, and that's unlike you in my experience. Tell us why you wrote it.
Well, it's quite a complicated story, but basically in the Illegal Migration Act, the Conservative government introduced something called the duty to remove, which said that if you enter the country illegally, you will not be entitled to claim asylum. There will be a legal bar on considering your asylum claim, and you must be removed either to your own country or to a safe third country. And obviously we had the agreement with Rwanda in place. And obviously that hadn't started, and there were various reasons as to why the deportations to Rwanda hadn't begun. And my personal view is our human rights laws need to change very profoundly for a policy like that to work. But when Labour came in, Yvette Cooper came to the House of Commons, and this is all quite familiar if you've listened to Rachel Reeves on the economy and the, I would say, fictional £22 billion fiscal hole that she's claimed. Yvette Cooper did something similar with asylum. She said that with a single stroke of her pen, by removing the retrospective elements of the duty to remove, which applied to 60-odd thousand illegal immigrants who wanted to claim asylum here. She would save the taxpayer £700 million a year for 10 years, so £7 billion just with this single thing, and said various things about how she'd never seen such a wasteful policy in her life as the duty to remove and the Rwanda policy. And I sat there in the House and thought, well, this number is clearly ridiculous. It can't be true. So I got hold of the Home Office impact assessment and went through it. And I also wrote to the Home Office Permanent Secretary and said, what are these numbers? And I asked a series of questions.
Timothy, you're a new boy. You're writing to permanent secretaries already. Anyone would think you used to run the place.
Well, I do know the Home Office quite well. I was there for 5 years, so I know how these...
God, they must love you, Nick Timothy. That's what
well, I hope they do.
He knows where the bodies are buried.
Well, I hope so.
But go on. It is a complicated story, but that's why I wanted us to focus on it, because
it's a complicated story. The Permanent Secretary's letter kind of gave the game away, because he, in his explanation as to how they got to this number, he contradicted the official impact assessment. So he said the £700 million includes estimates of the costs of the process of removing people to Rwanda, sending them to Rwanda, and so on. And the impact assessment, if you look at the detail, assumes that nobody will be removed to Rwanda. So they were double counting costs. But if you look at other things in the impact assessment, it basically admits that the number is completely spurious, because they don't know lots of things and they make loads of ridiculous assumptions about the previous Conservative policy. So they basically say that everybody in this cohort would have stayed in Britain and would have been living in hotels for 10 years. I mean, it's clearly a ridiculous proposition. And then on the alternative, which is the Labour policy of just saying, well, we'll consider all their asylum claims, they accept that they just exclude long lists of costs. So it's quite obvious that what they plan to do is grant these people asylum, and they admit that 70% of the cohort will be given asylum, and that of the remainder, lots of them will never be removed.
So around 45,000 of the 60,000.
Yeah. So they will basically hide these people in the welfare system, and they will disappear in the official statistics, because as long as they're the responsibility of the Home Office, the costs of these guys are published and we know what's going on. And as soon as they're granted asylum and they have access to the welfare system, they will just be counted along with all the other welfare claimants. And the documents basically admit that they don't know how much this will cost. And the British state studiously avoids trying to put proper costs on different profiles of migrants. But if you look at European studies, and they've done this kind of work in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, you're probably talking about each channel crosser costing the taxpayer over their lifetime net £400,000. So just for this particular cohort, and not extrapolating for all the others who will come over by crossing the channel, Labour's policy will cost £17.8 billion. So there's obviously a massive difference between what they claim is the cost of the Conservative policy and the Labour policy. But their costing of the Conservative policy is, I think, massively exaggerated, and the cost of their policy is hidden.
Nick, that's really quite profound stuff, and it's a twisty story, as you say, but I do think you explained it very well in your column, and I felt the research you did, what you went through, deserved a much broader audience, and I know that Alison did as well, and that's why I think it's very useful that you've outlined what happened over the summer here on Planet Normal.
Well, thanks for letting me do it, because I'm keen for as many people to know as possible.
And, we've both watched you closely since you entered Parliament, if I may say so. And I've often wondered what you must be thinking about what's going on in Downing Street, because, of course, you have real on-the-ground experience of what it's like to launch a new government, what it's like during the first couple of months of a government that's under political pressure with respect. What do you think the atmosphere is like at the moment in Downing Street? We've seen Keir Starmer's personal ratings plummet. We've seen Labour run smack into the brick wall that is the reality of governing. We've seen more and more people pointing to the fact that even though Labour have got a big majority, they only actually secured the support of 20% of the electorate. They scored 33% of the votes on a 60% turnout. How do you think people are coping in Downing Street at the moment? Do you feel sorry for them at all, given how difficult it is? And could this be a one-term Labour government?
Well, I think when the Prime Minister isn't shopping on Savile Row, going to football matches and Taylor Swift concerts, Downing Street itself seems quite shambolic. You have Morgan McSweeney, who ran the election campaign, with daggers drawn with Sue Gray, who's the chief of staff. You have the political side briefing against Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. There seems to be a lot of infighting and mistrust. And you can say, well, what does this matter? Who are these people? Does this have any relevance to the public? But this is the cockpit of the government, and it needs to be professional and clear. And it feels like actually it isn't. The thing about governments and prime ministers is early on, when somebody first becomes prime minister, the country really looks at them in a way that they don't normally. People are normally getting on with their lives. They're not political obsessives, but they want to try to get the measure of you. And I think in Starmer's case, he had been exposed a bit to the public during COVID. And certainly the experience on the doorstep is people tend to say, well, he's smart after the event. He's always criticizing with hindsight, never has solutions of his own. Then they watched him a bit in the election campaign, and his personal ratings were never that high. I mean, we should be honest as Conservatives that the country did want us gone. This election was a defeat for the Conservatives rather than a massive endorsement of Keir Starmer and Labour. And
it feels very different to 97, doesn't it? We're of a similar political vintage, if you like. In 97, you were a political obsessive watching closely. I was a political correspondent for the Financial Times. There was a genuine enthusiasm for Blair, wasn't there? The guy got 43% of the popular vote. There were some substantial figures on the incoming front bench. I don't think any of that applies in this case.
Yeah, and Blair definitely felt like a different proposition. There were Conservatives out in the country saying, well, he doesn't seem so bad. Let's see how it goes.
The co-pilot voted for Blair more than once.
Goodness me. I mean, who'd have thought that?
La Pearson.
Who would have thought that?
Yeah, no, seriously. But you know what she's like? She's very fickle. Until quite recently, she fancied Emmanuel Macron. You know what she's like.
Let's not go there. Yeah, so I think it's very different to those circumstances. There isn't the enthusiasm. In fact, I think there's quite a lot of fear in the country. And they haven't sought to reassure anybody. They haven't really sought to be very positive. And in these early weeks, this is when the country really judges you. And all they've really done is throw up a lot of negativity. It feels like
a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame.
Lots of finger pointing. It just feels like they're trying to refight the election campaign and not govern the country. And what they don't realize, or maybe they don't care, is that saying these things about the economy, and I think there is a real critique of the economy. We should be more productive. There's lots of things to say about the way we need to rebalance and things like that. But what they're saying about the economy, which isn't true about the fiscal hole, it's basically a mix of typical, in-year spending pressures and the pay settlements that they themselves have chosen to introduce. All of this has a real-world effect because it affects consumer confidence, investor confidence, and international businesses and investors who are looking at Britain thinking, okay, things haven't been that stable for a while. This is a government with a big majority. Can we put our money in Britain? And now looking at them thinking, well, it sounds like the economy isn't as strong as I thought it was. And these people are clearly eyeing up massive tax rises. And I don't think I want to put my money there.
Nick, you're saying that because, you have sharp political instincts and so on. I can corroborate what you just said because a lot of sort of my journalistic contacts, if you like, aren't in politics. They're in financial markets. And in the last couple of weeks, 3 people who between them control hundreds of billions of pounds worth of investment have rang me up to really say, come on, Liam, you know these people. What are they like? How do they really think? There is growing alarm out there at the idea of betting on growth. Of course, growth has stalled over the last couple of months. We've had 0% month-on-month GDP growth for the last 2 months. Betting on growth to try and make the public finances add up. And at the same time, raising taxes, as we're going to see on October the 30th, from what is already a 70-year high. The markets don't really buy that, the idea that tax rises are going to lead to growth, which is going to fix the public finances. I think that's a big narrative problem that Labour have. And we're already paying 89 billion quid a year, more than we spend on schools, on debt interest. I don't think interest rates are going to come down very fast, actually. I think we could end up with just one interest rate cut this year. We've already had it in August. Across the Western world, inflation's remaining sticky and stubbornly above target. Of course, we've just seen the number out this week from the UK, 2.2% again, with the Bank of England predicting that we're going to see inflation rising this autumn. And if this is how Labour are in terms of infighting in Downing Street when the media is mostly on side and they're still broadly in their honeymoon, if this is how Labour are when the trade unions are mollified because they're munching on the big pay increases that they've just been given, be they, quasi-private sector unions in terms of the train drivers and so on, or NHS-related unions, what's the extent of the infighting going to be when it gets really tough and the media is going for the jugular and the markets are shaky and it's clear that some of Labour's pledges just are impossible to implement? You'll remember the TBGBs, the rows between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I think we could see even worse under Starmer's government based on what we've seen in the first 10 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think the big difference between the Blair years and the TBGBs, it's a blast from the past, isn't it?
Yeah.
Blair was undoubtedly a social democrat. He massively increased state spending. He massively increased the interventions of the state. Taxes and borrowing went up. But he was by instinct a reformer. And what was the famous phrase? He said, if you take the traditional Labour approach against the traditional Conservative Party, you get the traditional result. He was always sort of mindful of the fact that the Labour Party couldn't be what its instincts tell it to be. And if you look at Starmer and Reeves, and somehow actually sitting in the chamber watching them gives you a slightly different perspective of them, they are socialists. They are unreconstructed. Their instinct is to see something that somebody has built or worked hard to achieve or made sacrifices, to build up their savings or their pension or whatever, and to want to take it away because it's not fair that they have it when others don't. And this instinct to try to equalize all the time, in the end, can't be anything other than destructive. And when you apply it to business, and they're talking about things like capital gains tax, it's not a game in a debating chamber. People respond to incentives and disincentives. Businesses don't get sold. Investors decide not to come. And that has effects for all of us in terms of the jobs that aren't made, the taxes that aren't collected, and therefore tax rates go up and families don't have what they would in a prosperous economy. It's really destructive stuff, but that's what they are.
Now on to our Planet Normal guest. Tom Tugendhat's the MP for Tonbridge, having entered Parliament in 2015. A former Minister of State for Security, Tom made his name in politics as chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee from 2017 to 2022. Before politics, Tom was in the British Army, serving on operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Educated at Bristol and Cambridge, he also served as military assistant and principal advisor to the UK's Chief of Defence Staff. One of the 4 candidates left in the Tory leadership contest, along with former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly and frontrunners, former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick and former Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch, Tom draws much of his support from the so-called One Nation Tory MPs on the left of the Conservative Party. I started by asking Tom why he wants to lead the Tories, why he wants to be Prime Minister.
Well, Liam, I want to lead my party because I think it's the best vehicle for the hopes and dreams of the British people to be made into reality, into the kind of policies that actually deliver opportunity, growth, freedom, the values that I think are fundamentally British. And to your point that this is an important moment for the country, I completely agree. We know, because we've just seen this experiment run before, the reality is the opposition really matters. Having Corbyn as leader of the opposition was incredibly toxic for this country and brought a darkness back into British public life that, frankly, many of us thought had gone for generations. And so being the leader of the opposition isn't just a waiting room job. It's not just a holding position. It's a really important constitutional position, making sure that you're pushing the government into the right way. But I don't want to be leader of the opposition. I want to be Prime Minister. And I'm standing because I know that this Conservative Party can be back in power in 5 years if we choose the right leader, if we focus on the policies that actually make this country strong, and we deliver for the British people.
Tom, you are unashamedly a kind of one nation Conservative. You're from the traditional left of the right, the Tory reform group, we used to call it back in the old days, didn't we? And yet your party, a lot of Conservatives stayed at home. We know that because they didn't feel the Tory party has been Conservative enough. Reform may only have 5 seats, but they got, as you know, 15% of the vote. The Lib Dems only got 11% of the vote, even though they got 71 seats. That's our first past the post voting system, I guess. But what would you say to those who argue that the Conservative Party shouldn't be competing in the centre ground? It shouldn't be trying to out Miliband. It shouldn't be taking on the Lib Dems, even though in seats like yours and in some of the shires, it was the Lib Dems that you had to face down in order to come back to Parliament. But actually, the big opportunity here in politics is on the centre-right. It's the silent majority. The Overton window of the public is to the right, many people would say, of the Overton window in the eyes of the political and media class.
Look, Liam, I'd say they're absolutely right that the common ground of conservatism is on those areas where we're looking after people's liberties and defending their freedoms, right? And I think that's where the One Nation label, I think, has been misused, because I'd describe as a One Nation colleague, a strong One Nation colleague. In fact, somebody's written a book on what it is to be One Nation, somebody like Nick Timothy. Now, he's very often described as being to the right of me, but actually I'd say we're both conservatives. Now, I think there's an error that has crept in, if you'll forgive me, into journalism shorthand, which is where were you on the Brexit referendum, as though that was the defining issue on left and right. And as we know, Corbyn wanted to vote to leave, but you wouldn't argue he was on the right, and other people voted to remain who were very much on the right. So it's not a shorthand in the way that people see it. My argument is that actually to be One Nation is about bringing the country together. It's about making sure that you bring back industry to the north, to the northeast. It's about making sure that you champion that relationship between the state and society that Ben Houchen does so brilliantly in Teesside. It's about making sure that, as you rightly put it, we represent the centre of the Conservative Party, not the centre of the country. And that heart of the Conservative Party is that balance between different views. And that's where you see people like me standing up for values that some people would call right-wing. Now, when you were championing, and you were absolutely vital during those dark days of COVID, in championing personal liberty and standing up against, frankly, what had become a relatively totalitarian perspective.
We like to call it common sense.
But you're absolutely right. And it's listening to you, listening to Alison, the way you spoke about it, and I was on the rocket ship and right thinking, as you put it, listening to the way you put it, was one of the reasons I voted against vaccine passports. Now, does that put me on the left or the right? I don't think it does either. I think it puts me solidly in the common ground of conservatism and of liberty, right? I think that's all it does. And when I refused to vote for the rise in national insurance contributions, does that put me on the left or the right? Well, I don't think it does either. I think it puts me in the solid common ground of conservative thinking.
But
And
don't
so
the
I think
Tories
that's
at
where
this moment of all moments need branding? They need clarity to try and win back public trust so the party knows what you stand for. And isn't the real fight for the Conservative Party indeed the route to power? Isn't that taking on reform? Isn't that wooing back all those stay-at-home Tories? Because Starmer won a third of the vote on a 60% turnout. He won 20% of the electorate.
Yeah.
4 out of 5 people didn't vote for Starmer. Do you really want to go over after those votes when so many of your traditional voters stayed at home and or have defected to reform and or will defect to reform over the coming months?
So, Liam, that's exactly right. So the reality is Conservative voters went all over the place. They found many different ways to vote against us. And when you look at the results across the country, you can see that what people were doing was they weren't choosing an alternative prime minister when they voted against us. They were making sure that we were out. And you saw that by people staying at home. Some people voted Lib Dem, a lot voted Reform, a lot voted, in fact, in some parts of the country, a lot voted Green. And the idea that there's much overlap there is strange, but people did. And what they were doing is they were choosing the way to get rid of us. And what we've got to do to win back the legitimacy and the right to govern this country and the right to deliver on the hopes of the British people is to make sure we are expressing the values that we share. And I don't care whether you're talking about Reform or the Lib Dems or Labour or the Greens, there are some basic values that we share. We do stand for protecting our borders. We do stand for actually keeping our country safe. We do stand for making sure people can have access to the public services they need, whether it's the hospitals, whether it's buying a home. These are public services, one provided by the state, one provided by the private sector, but they are public services. And we need to stand for all of those. And that's why when I gave a speech on public services the other day, what I spoke about was all those shared values that we need to bring back. So you're right, we lost a lot of votes to Reform. You're completely correct. We lost more to stay at home and we lost others to various other parties. We've got to bring them all back.
But are those stay-at-home Tories, which I think are absolutely vital?
Yeah.
We know about these stay-at-home Tories because many of them listen to Planet Normal and they write to us in volumes. Surely they're the people that you've got to try and woo back.
You're absolutely right.
Aren't they? You know, you talked about Priti Patel.
I did.
She was the first of the candidates to be ousted by the MPs. Of course, the MPs vote, choose 2 candidates, and then those 2 candidates go forward to the party and the country, the activists, the envelope stuffers, the people that are going to deliver you an election victory if the Tories ever win an election again. And we are in that kind of realms, aren't we? As you say, we are in a sort of existential moment for the party at this time. So Priti lost. You said, some people say because you were trying to woo her MP supporters, this is crazy. Priti's one of the most popular MPs among the Conservative grassroots, which she is, and MPs have got rid of her before any other candidate. So why, Tom Tugendhat, should you then go through? Because clearly Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick are far more popular among the grassroots than you are.
Well, actually, it depends where you look at the polls, actually. I'm more popular than Rob at the moment on the polls, and you can see that. I'm roughly as popular as Kemi, and Kemi is very popular on Con Home survey. That's certainly true, but on other surveys, that's not so obvious. My point was, Kemi is a really good friend of mine, right? We were on the Foreign Affairs Committee together. We travelled together. She and I worked together incredibly closely to deliver not just the Hong Kong scheme, which was incredibly important for saving a whole bunch of British nationals overseas who were a threat from a vile dictatorship in Beijing. And we worked together as well on the Afghan scheme, a scheme that you were incredibly supportive of and for which I'm very grateful, of getting those refugees from Afghanistan who had served with us in combat, getting them to a place of safety. Now, Priti is a great friend because she's a true Conservative, and we share just such an overlap of values because actually we both come from that same Conservative tradition of standing up for freedom, standing up for personal liberty, personal dignity, and aiming for lower taxes. And that's what we've both been on. So I said it because it's true. And Priti and I have also done something that I think is really important. Both of us have spent much of our parliamentary career going around to different associations around the country to talk to people. So,
look, no one's saying you're not a nice man, Tom, and no one's saying that you're not collegiate. That shines through in the way you conduct your politics, at least in public, if I may say so. There's always some skullduggery going on just off camera in politics, isn't there? But you're clearly somebody who wants to be consensual, who wants to be collegiate. aren't we at a point in this country's history and in your party's history, it may be time to crack a few eggs. It may be time to disrupt. It may be time for really clear lines and primary colours rather than some kind of consensus. It may be a bit of a late 70s moment.
Well, it's certainly a late 70s moment with what Keir Starmer's doing. I mean, he's bringing all the union power back. Now, you want primary colours, and you're absolutely right. We want to stand up for British jobs and British workers. That's why I've been so clear on China. That's why I've been so clear on bringing jobs home and not allowing this bizarre Miliband ethos of exporting proper, hardworking, in fact, unionised jobs from the UK on a net zero, not an absolute zero, but a net zero economy in favour of shipping them out to some sort of massive coal-powered job factory in China. I mean, it's
the
ridiculous.
road to net zero must not be built from the jobs of our workers,
No, exactly
says
right.
Sharon Graham, leader of the second biggest union, evoking the miners' strike.
I can't believe I'm quoting Unite, but she's right.
Evoking chaos and violence in industrial relations just a few months into a Labour government.
But she's not only right. Look at what you can do in this country. Look at what Ben Houchen's doing. He's building a net zero turbine. Not absolute zero, net zero. It's going to burn gas. It's going to offshore the carbon capture.
Have we gone a bit mad with all this green stuff? You and I would agree. We absolutely want to see a rundown of hydrocarbons, fossil fuels over many years. Yeah. Have we gone a bit sandwich board, a bit the end of the world is nigh, Tom Tugendhat? I mean, what's the point in being a climate change leader? Doesn't it make Britain look a bit like a mug?
Well, it depends what you're doing. What Ben Houchen's doing is genuine climate change leadership. It's building a gas-powered turbine that captures the carbon and pumps it back underground. That's the kind of leadership that you can export around the world. The kind of leadership that Ed Miliband's talking about, where it's basically poverty and misery for everyone. Nobody's going to follow you on that route.
But he's only been in 2 months. I mean, he's basically building on, OK, they're tweaking their climate policy now. Maybe they'll bring the ban on new petrol and diesel cars back to 2030. I don't think they will. I don't even think 2035 is going to stick, if I'm honest, for various reasons. Do you?
I'd be very questioning whether it's deliverable.
Are we overdoing this sort of climate change alarmism? Do we risk undermining the very laudable cause of lowering fossil fuels over a period of time with climate extremism?
Let's be clear, Liam. Neither of us are denying that climate change has had human causes. Neither of us are denying that carbon is part of that. And both of us would argue that energy security in the United Kingdom requires a change in the way we produce energy domestically. I think it's one of the reasons why we've both spoken publicly in favour of nuclear and particularly in favour of these small modular reactors that Rolls-Royce are building out of Derby. But this is where we need to actually have solutions, because the truth is, if you want growth in this country, the biggest thing you can do is bring down energy prices. If you want a true industrial revolution in this country onto the technology sector, you need another industrial revolution. And the way that you do that, cheaper energy. And so consistently, we need to be lowering the cost of energy. And we've gone from having energy roughly in the middle of the pack for the industrialised nations of the world to one of the most expensive in the world.
Often the most expensive
very often.
in Western Europe.
Very often. Even
though as we keep boasting, Mr. Miliband, we have a high share of renewables in our electricity generation mix, often 40, 50%.
Yeah, that's
even
right.
more on some days. So it's not true that renewables are cheap, are they?
No, that's not true. But what is true is that you can achieve net zero, not absolute zero. And what Ed Miliband keeps trying to do is absolute zero. That's ridiculous. Trying to achieve net zero is something different. And what we've got to do is stick to the net zero. Net zero is about carbon capture and storage. It's about making sure that you are switching out of coal into gas, switching out of those sort of really bad carbon emissions into the better ones and making sure you're on that journey. Now, that's the journey that we are on, or rather we were on before Ed Miliband decided to sort of tear up the roots.
Are the Conservatives partly to blame for getting us to this point, Tom Tugendhat? Because you have been in power for 14 years, and haven't we been a bit too zealous, a bit too keen on bad messages about the environment? Oh, you just don't understand. Don't we need to really consider the cost of living issues for a lot of the households, a lot of the workers? 2,500 jobs at Port Talbot gone in the name of net zero. Grangemouth has just closed, the only refinery in Scotland.
So look,
500 jobs gone.
I mean, it's more than that, because it's 500 plus, probably another 500, and 2,000 plus another 2,000.
I'm just saying what we definitely know, so no one can accuse me of over-egging.
No, you and I know there's knock-on. So let's talk about the Port Talbot works, right? It's not only about energy costs, although that's a huge element of it. It's also the fact that being able to produce your own steel is a fundamental element of national security.
High grade,
exactly right. High-grade steel is a fundamental element of national security. If you can't do it, guess who you're buying off?
Yeah.
You're buying off China, right? So this is a real challenge. And this is why Ed Miliband is absolutely wrong, why the Labour Party's policies are absolutely wrong, and why you're right, we should have been building nuclear power stations in the 2010, in that first coalition government, when the Lib Dems actively opposed it on the grounds that a nuclear power station wouldn't be ready till 2021. I mean,
but come on, let's be honest, this is meant to be renewal of your own party. You guys got stuff wrong.
Yeah, we did.
This.
No, we did. Sorry, I mean, forgive me.
What do you think you got wrong? What would you have done different in retrospect?
So in retrospect, I would have driven much more nuclear power into the energy mix way earlier. That's something we should have done. Instead, we got absolutely wedded to these massive nuclear reactors that frankly bring with them huge amounts of planning issues, huge amounts of challenges. We need to get into those small modular reactors that, by the way, we're exporting very effectively in concept stage at this point, but to places like Poland. And we need to make sure that we are investing properly in the North Sea and in the carbon capture and storage that actually makes it net zero viable. And there you see, I mean, I was up in Aberdeen a few weeks ago with Offshore Energies, an amazing outfit demonstrating what you can produce. Because this is one of those areas where the UK genuinely leads the world. You look at what we're producing in Scotland, look at what we're producing outside, just off the coast of Teesside. We are producing really high quality energy and energy security at a low cost for this country. That's vital. Whatever you want to produce, whatever you want to do, whatever business you're in or whatever occupation you're doing, you need cheaper energy. And that's one of those areas where you're right, we didn't do enough.
Is immigration the most important issue in British politics, as Nigel Farage says?
It's certainly one of the most important, right? I mean, you saw the riots this summer. You saw the issues that arose over the last few years. We're seeing everything from the disassociation of people from place to the challenges of people to get either on the housing ladder or into hospitals or whatever. But this is one of those areas where, you know, and you've spoken about this yourself, you can't achieve this unless you're willing to take on the vested interests in the economy. Because look what we've done. And this is an area where we've made a mistake. Let's be absolutely clear about it. In December 2020, we had 20,700 so-called Tier 2 visas, skilled visas, of people coming into the UK. In January 2021, that changed. We went to the points-based system. We were lobbied by businesses and people from whether they were in education or in trade or whatever it was. Every single person agreed with the target and then said, yeah, but my bit's different. But my universities need this. My farmers need this. My curry houses need this. And so everybody agreed in principle and disagreed in practice. That's not okay. That's why I've set a 100,000 target. No, sorry, not even target, cap. And the reason I've set it as a cap is because unless you are very clear with business, 4 years out, I don't want to have 4 years of opposition, but we have got 4 years of opposition. Unless you're very clear right from the beginning, you need to change your business model. You cannot have a low-wage, high-immigration model and make it work. We need to spend the next 4 years making sure we change the direction of the economy so that we're going to a high-skilled, high-wage immigration model, which is smaller, and we make sure that the people who can work in the United Kingdom are encouraged to work. And that's where we need to change benefits and change the way we're encouraging people into action.
And yet, Tom, not wishing to reopen old wounds, a lot of Planet Normal listeners will be screaming at their phones or wherever they listen to the podcast. They'll be saying, that's all very well, Tom, but you voted Remain. You voted to keep Britain in a freedom of movement area.
Yeah, but look at the numbers.
A freedom of movement area that's now clearly breaking up. Wasn't that a mistake?
No, it's different. Look at what was happening before we were in the European Union. Look what's happening since. The rocket, to put it mildly, came after we left.
No, sure. But we were already at 650,000 in 2015, right? So we were already in 650,000 immigration in 2016, just before the Brexit vote. You understand that we've left the European Union, and yet because of the mistakes that you've just discussed, immigration went to 275, right? The size of Sheffield in 1 year in 2022, 2023. But wasn't it a mistake to remain in a freedom of movement area in retrospect? I mean, if Keir Starmer wanted to take us back into a freedom of movement area...
Well, no, I'd oppose it. But
you'd oppose it?
Yeah, I would. And by the way,
before you supported it?
Well, I'd oppose going back into any European Union deal now, because I just don't think we'd have the seat at the table. It wouldn't work. And the job of life is to move forward, not to move backwards. And we need to make sure what we're doing is standing up for the interests of the British people going forward. But look, when you raise those issues, you're completely correct to raise them. And if you want to argue correctly that we did not use the controls that we had, you're absolutely right. I mean, you spoke about this way back when you were writing about the Brexit referendum. The number of controls that we had that we simply didn't use, even before we left, were huge. We did not use huge amounts of controls that were actually within our power. And then actually, funnily enough, Germany is using now. They've just, as you know, they've just closed their borders, and now they're deciding on not allowing various elements of people to come over and just claim benefits. So people can do it. We didn't. We need to.
Do you believe in the blob? Do you believe that some parts of Whitehall are too powerful? Do you believe it when you hear former cabinet ministers say that they couldn't do what they wanted to do because civil servants, some, were obstructionist?
I definitely believe in inertia. Every single bureaucracy in the world, they want to turn up and do the same job they did yesterday, today. Right? And that's absolutely
Yeah, but
standard.
we don't live in the world. We live in the UK. So...
In the UK, it's the same as true, right? There is definitely inertia in the civil service. And that's why one of the first things we've got to do before we get it back into government is we've got to have a proper plan for reforming the civil service. The reality is not only is it not delivering for us, but Labour have just massively politicised it. Look at the appointments they've just made, not just into SPADs, which is something everybody's always done, special advisors, which is something everybody's always done, which is, perfectly reasonable. But they've actually put them straight into the civil service. This is a complete change in the way that civil services works, and we've got to actually put conservative values back into these organisations. And the only way to do that, I'm afraid, is to have serious reform.
Time's pressing on. The Planet Normal rocket is coming in to land. Tell us about how the British military should look in 10 years' time, Tom. This is an area very close to your heart. Of course, you served in the British Army very proudly. You retain very close links. In a nutshell, Britain's armed forces in 10 years' time.
So look, there are so many lessons to draw. Look at the technology change that we're seeing in Ukraine. Look at the technology change we're seeing in Israel. Look at the lessons we can draw from partners and allies who are quite literally on the front line in two different kinds of conflict that we're seeing there. And look at what that means for our recruitment and for our training, but also for our supplies. We need to become much more dynamic, much more responsive to the evolution of technology, not just cutting large bits of steel, which is something that British technology has done for 150, 200 years, but actually transforming ourselves again and constantly with the evolutions of technology. Now, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan and saw the evolution that we did in those days, but actually it's rocketing ahead, quite literally rocketing ahead when you see the way drones have changed combat.
Isn't it inevitable, Tom, for all the traditions of our armed forces, for all the incredible symbolic importance of certain regiments and their illustrious history and so on, isn't it inevitable with the best will in the world? You've just majored there on the technological aspects of defence. Isn't it inevitable that the head count will drop?
Well, it shouldn't. And it would be a mistake to. In fact, we should be raising more men and women to serve in our armed forces. First of all, it's very good for us, as in it creates a bunch of people who have service as an ethos running through them like a stick of rock, and it's something that's really good for society. Secondly, you can't replace people. Technology does not replace people. Fundamentally, conflict, war, is about that challenge between groups of people. And at the end of it, you need to have people who are willing to impose their will on others. That's what conflict is fundamentally about. And that's what we need to train and recruit people to do. So we need to have more young people. The last point is we need the leadership to deliver it. And frankly, that's why I'm standing, because we need a change in leadership in this country that values our national defence and understands what it is to stand up for this country in the toughest places in the world.
Last two questions. So Alison and I talk often about this Tory leadership contest, of course. We're exasperated, Tom, both of us. We often disagree, as you know, and that's part of the beauty of the podcast, that we can disagree agreeably and with respect. But we both agree on this. Labour came into office in early July. Why is it that your party won't have a leader of the opposition until early November, Tom? 4 months. The public obviously isn't particularly interested in the niceties of the mechanics of whether Tom Tugendhat's beating Mel Stride. That's for the obsessives like us. But the country as a whole, they're going to want to see a leader of the opposition stand up on the 30th of October and challenge this historic budget, a budget that, in the word of Labour insiders, is going to be punitive for ordinary people. Surely, after party conference, get it at the beginning of October, get it done and dusted by mid-October. So the leader of the opposition, not Rishi Sunak, whose mind is probably in LA anyway, you're smiling, even a leader of the opposition who can stand up at the dispatch box and challenge this budget. If you guys are still doing all the parlour games of vote rigging and all the rest of it, as the rest of the country is saying, what is this budget about? You're going to look indulgent. You're going to look bad.
Liam, the reason I'm smiling is because this is the point I made in an interview with one of your colleagues on the Sunday Telegraph a week or so ago. I've had enough of the game playing in Westminster. I've just had enough of it.
But specifically, would you bring...
Yes. Sorry, let me be absolutely clear. Yes, we should have a leader of the opposition who is able to respond to a budget, because that budget is going to set the agenda for this government and for this parliament.
So you want to see the thing wrapped up a couple of weeks after Tory conference, not a whole month after Tory conference?
I was asked about this a few weeks ago. I was asked whether I'd like to respond as leader of the opposition to the budget. I said, of course I would. It's going to be one of those seminal moments in this parliament where you are able to pin Labour down and show the damage that they are doing to ordinary families across our country, to businesses who are employing people, to older people who are trying to retire, trying to make plans, but won't be able to. And that is holding back young people from having homes and opportunities in the future. This is really serious. This is a Labour government that has decided that it wants to take off older people and give to its union paymasters, not to support business, not to support growth, but to support taxing in order to spend on its own mates. That is wrong. And we need to make sure that we have a vocal, powerful and strong voice on the other side of the dispatch box to point out that what Rachel Reeves is doing isn't some sort of management economics. It's actually, in your words, and you're absolutely right, punitive. It is actually punishing the British people and taking away hope from the future.
Finally, Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself that we don't know, the Tom Tugendhat hinterland. You don't strike me as a political obsessive, by the way. You strike me as a regular guy who happens to be involved in politics. What is it that really floats your boat outside the world of Westminster?
Oh, most of my life is outside the world of Westminster, Liam. Look, the reality is I got into politics because I served in Iraq in 2003, and one of the people I served with was an extraordinary guy who had been taken into care as a child, joined the Royal Marines to get out of care, effectively to escape, and grew up and ended up as Sergeant Major in a Royal Marines unit, which is where I met him, and has since left and actually done very well for himself. And I remember we were laid up in a waddy waiting and watching, as you do over the night and into the morning. And we were whispering to each other, as you do as well, and telling each other stories about our past. And what struck me is how he had found a way out of the broken home and the broken environment he'd come to, but his brothers and sisters hadn't. And I thought, it can't be right that the only way that this country helps people escape from those backgrounds is through the military. It just can't be right? It's not for everybody. And it got me thinking, how on earth do we make this country better? How do we bring people together? How do we actually serve the British people? How do we put government back to the service of the British people? And how do we remember what the Conservative Party is for? And the Conservative Party is fundamentally to serve, to deliver the dreams, the hopes, the aspirations of the British people into actual policies that deliver. That's what we're here for. And what we need is leadership to deliver that. And that's why I stood, because I think if you think you have something to offer your country, I think you have a responsibility to stand up and serve. And I did. And now that I'm here, I'm standing to lead the Conservative Party because I think it is the greatest vehicle for national success that this country has seen, whether it's the house building of Macmillan, whether it's the liberation of the economy of Thatcher, whether it's the liberation of Europe of Churchill, whether it's... I can go back through Conservative history. The common thread is that sense of belonging, that sense of patriotism and purpose that brings people together. That's the action that actually unites. So that's why I'm standing, because I want to serve this country. I want to lead the Conservative Party so that we can lead the country together. And I want to act in our national interest because, frankly, sometimes I feel that we've forgotten what that is.
Tom Tugendhat, Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks, Liam.
On Planet Normal. So there you have it. Nick Timothy. It's not often a co-presenter gets mentioned in a guest's interview, but you are, of course, a supporter of Tom Tugendhat in this leadership race. This is very much a Tom Tugendhat edition of Planet Normal. We've had a long interview with Kemi Badenoch, of course, and we'll be looking to interview the other two candidates for the Tory leadership before that contest expires. Tell us what you thought of how your man performed in the cockpit of the rocket of right thinking.
Yeah, no, it made me jump when you mentioned my name. I wasn't expecting it. I thought it was very Tom, right? He's a good guy. I think it always comes across with him. And I think actually whether somebody is likeable is quite an underrated and under-discussed part of politics. I also think we talk about where somebody sits on an ideological spectrum or within a party or something. But actually, this is the series of interviews for a really important job.
Yeah.
And so actually my starting point is, can he do the job? And this is the main reason why I support him. I think we can go on to some of the things that he's said he would do as leader, but I'm convinced by Tom on the basis of his leadership qualities. I saw them close up because I was asked to do a review of some of the operations of the Home Office about 18 months or so ago. So I saw him working in the department when he was a minister, and I could really see how people responded to him because he does have those leadership qualities, in which you can imagine were learned in the military. So I think that's very important. And then I think in terms of what he's saying, well, yes, immigration was one of our biggest broken promises, and he's got a clear policy on that, a legal cap that government can't wriggle out of. He's saying that actually we complained a lot about the culture wars and the inefficiencies of the state, but we didn't do enough to actually change those things. But he's also saying, well, there's actually quite a lot of agreement in the Conservative Party about those things, but we also have to think about our offer on the economy and on the reform of public services. And I think he's tried to broaden the conversation through the contest so far, which I think is really important because we do have to have a kind of full spectrum offer. So there are very few people as hardline as me on immigration. That alone is not enough. We need to also have a clear offer on the NHS, on the future of schools and so on. And as a candidate in the election, and other candidates have said the same kind of thing to me, you would walk up a driveway and knock on a door, and quite often when the person who answered the door was, I don't know, a 45-year-old woman with school-aged children, you'd think, she's not going to vote for us. And that was the position we'd got ourselves into at this election, because... Just
writing off whole swathes of the electorate, whole demographic subgroups.
Yeah, the cost of living had hurt them. They were not happy with the state of public services. They felt that we'd broken our promises on immigration.
But let me put this to you, Nick. I completely agree with you. Tom Tugendhat is a nice guy, right? And I don't mean that in a condescending way. He's a decent guy. He's got a tremendous reputation if you talk to people at the top of the armed services. He's well liked across the House, not just in your party, but among other parties too. There's a lot of respect for him. But is that what the Tories need now? Do they need a nice guy, or do they need a disruptor? Someone who, as I said to Tom, is going to break a few eggs to remake the Tory omelette. I put it to you, what I said to Tom, the Overton window of where the centre ground is among our political and media class, maybe somewhere between Starmer, the Lib Dems, and the left of the Tory party. But the actual Overton window, where the public is to the right of that. Whether it's on immigration, whether it's on the high tax burden that we have, on a whole range of issues, on net zero in particular, as I wrote at the weekend, you've now got growing concerns about the impact of those policies on the lives and livelihoods of millions of ordinary people and some really strategic UK industrial assets. Surely the Tories need to take on reform. Surely the Tories need to attract back all those Tory voters who stayed at home because they didn't think their party was conservative anymore. Isn't there a danger that Tom Tugendhat, nice guy as he is the wrong man for that job?
Well, I agree with everything you said until the final proposition.
Yeah, sure.
Because you're right. I've written for years that I think the centre ground is a very convenient myth for people who are liberals. And broadly speaking, the centre ground is taken to mean economic and social liberalism, moderation because it's between right and left, and where the majority of the public is. And it's just not true. Those three things cannot all be true at the same time. And we do need to think in terms of the common ground and to think about where the public really are. And immigration is a great example of that, where people just want radical reductions in the numbers of people coming here. They want people to be deported from the country if they commit crimes. They don't have any truck with people coming to the country illegally. And now, because the numbers have got so high that this has become kind of anchored in the minds of liberal commentators and some politicians. And if you want to talk about getting to levels of migration that the public are comfortable with, they think that this is an act of extremism. It's completely ridiculous and self-serving and quite often dishonest. So yeah, we totally need a disruptor, but you also need the leadership qualities to be able to do that successfully. And I think one of the lessons of the last several years is it's not just who can say the popular thing or who can say my policy is this, but it's also who can convince the public that you mean it and who can get those things actually done if you find yourself back in power. Now, I mean, I happen to think that all four of the candidates would be good leaders of the Conservative Party, and I would be comfortable with any one of them leading me. But as I said, the reason I've supported Tom from the start is because I think he has those leadership qualities and the kind of personality to get people to listen to him when he says these things. If you look at what he's actually said, I think the way we talk about right and left is not necessarily that helpful anyway. But he's said if ECHR membership gets in the way of us deporting illegal immigrants, then we leave it. He said
that's the European Convention on Human Rights, which has become quite a totemic issue.
Yeah,
among the Tory leadership candidates.
Yeah, he said. And by the way, this is not a tactical thing for the leadership campaign. He first wrote about derogating from the ECHR before he was an MP. And the legal cap on immigration that is proposed is far tougher than anything that the party did in government over 14 years. So he's obviously clearly prepared to go to these places and quite sincerely believes them himself. But believing something isn't enough. You've got to be able to do it. And the people have to believe you.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
This is from David. Dear co-pilots on the rocket of right thinking, I've enjoyed my journey with you since the early days of COVID. You've helped my wife and me to keep from plummeting into a deep depression by your wry commentary on current events. I've been struck by the recent announcement of the lifetime costs to the taxpayer of low-skilled migrants. It's scandalous. I then wondered about the use of this metric. How many low-skilled migrants would it take to equal the lifetime costs, salary, pension, etc., of, say, a diversity professional in the public sector? Why not use the same cost-value metrics for all those in the public sector whose costs are entirely borne by the taxpayer? Perhaps it's generally too frightening a number for public consumption. One for Valma to investigate? Looking forward to the ongoing journey, David.
I'm going to resist the temptation to do a Scooby-Doo impression there in honour of Alison's absence. Mark has been in touch from Switzerland with his thoughts on the economy. Dear cosmonauts, firstly, thank you for your fantastic weekly podcast. I've been an avid listener since the beginning and enjoy both of your takes on current affairs as well as the different perspectives from your guests. And I'm a Scooby fan for what it's worth. There you go. The ongoing debate about whether or not Planet Normal should feature Scooby-Doo impressions. Ooh. I'm aghast at the financial incompetence of the current government, says Mark, although the Conservatives weren't much better. I appreciated Liam's reflection on the financial performance of the British economy under Major leading up to the 97 election, with strong growth and limited net migration. Indeed, it was well under 100,000 a year. I like to think in terms of a company business model as a sanity check for the British economy, says Mark. Taking a step back, we're writing off our natural assets in our inventory, coal, gas, oil, to import them instead. We're then underusing our human capital and paying them to do nothing at home whilst filling the gap by employing foreign workers. This, though, requires us to use precious financial capital to build houses, schools, hospitals, roads to accommodate them. We're chasing away wealth-creating employees while absorbing ever more low-skilled employees with a liability to support them throughout their life should they stay. We have a stock of perfectly serviceable cars as well, says Mark, which we're deciding to scrap early before they don't work anymore, to replace them with expensive imported electric vehicles. We're creating the conditions where it's ever more expensive to produce goods in Britain with high energy costs and increasing regulation, the result being that businesses will close and will import even more. We're completely forgetting, says Mark, that we're competing with other countries. If Britain were a business, we'd be going bankrupt. I fear that it won't be long before we wake up to the reality that as a country, we're on the road to ruin. Best wishes, and please keep the podcast going. Well, Mark, I would say cheer up, but we've had a lot of emails along these lines.
Yeah. On the subject of last week's interview with the motor entrepreneur Robert Forrester, Jerry writes, "Hello, an interesting podcast this week, including an informative interview with Robert Forrester. It's not often that I take issue with Alison, but I'm an EV driver. I came to this decision after a lot of research. I'm a retired chartered engineer and I like to get into the nitty-gritty. So far, my vehicle works really well for me, lovely to drive and minuscule running costs, and I wasn't coerced by the government or anyone else. Obviously, these aren't for everyone, but a far more realistic proposition than many people think. However, one of the reasons for the slow uptake of these cars is the huge amount of disinformation that appears in the media, such as they all catch fire, which they don't. The batteries only last until lunchtime. There's nowhere to charge. It's all rubbish. And given the facts, many more people would conclude there's a lot to like. And I can honestly say, I don't find my current car worse in any way at all. Regards, Jerry."
Good email, Jerry. You'll find no misinformation on this podcast, just facts and common sense analysis. Continuing with the EV discussion, Colin, who's an engineer, writes to say, "Liam, you are quite right to say China has the bulk of the world's capacity for producing refined rare earth metals, but they're not used in lithium-ion batteries. They're vital instead for the production of high field strength magnets, which are essential components of compact, high-power electric motors and generators in EVs and wind turbines, along with a host of other devices such as hearing aids, haptic actuators in mobile phone, headphones, loudspeakers, particle accelerators," I did tell you he's an engineer, "medical scanners and many other applications," says Colin. "Even the magnetrons in microwave cookers and the alternators in normal fossil-fueled cars. I don't think I've missed more than half a dozen episodes of Planet Normal," says Colin, "since you and Alison started. Please keep them coming and keep finding such interesting people to interview. With best wishes, Colin."
Now, John has some thoughts on Ed Miliband. Mad Millie, as Ed is affectionately referred to in the dog queues at Port Talbot Job Centre, is about to experience the extremely unsettling effects of what is known as Mike Tyson syndrome, or MTS. This can be expressed quite simply as, "Oh, they've all got a plan until they're punched in the gob," referring to his upcoming opponent in the boxing ring. He danced around quite prettily until he was lying on the floor with a glazed look in his eyes. Let's hope Mad Millie listened to your excellent interview with Robert Forrester so he could maybe avoid catching MTS himself. Regards, John.
And I must say, that Robert Forrester interview, it was an interesting one. We don't often interview business leaders on Planet Normal, and we should do it more because they always come up with incredibly interesting insights from the front line of the economy. Robert Forrester is, of course, the co-founder and CEO of Virtue Motors PLC, one of the UK's largest car dealerships. They control 192 dealerships across the country from their headquarters in the North East. Do catch up with Robert's interview on last week's Planet Normal. And finally, dear Alison and Liam, this is from Charles. "I was amused to hear you discuss Robert Jenrick a couple of weeks ago. This will be the same Robert Jenrick who went swanning around the country during the start of the COVID lockdown after telling everyone to stay put. This would also be the same Robert Jenrick who was dismissed by Boris Johnson over a rather strange planning decision. Imagine the gift to the Labour Party of having a leader who got fired for impropriety by a man of Boris Johnson's reputation. Mr. Jenrick resigned about immigration, says Charles, but there is a little stray thought that says it was an easy decision given that he was passed over for the top job. I fear the Tories will appoint a man with a checkered past who would be a gift to Labour, Reform and the Lib Dems. I don't really care, as the last time I voted Conservative was in 2015 in order to obtain a Brexit vote. What's your opinion? Am I a stuck-in-the-mud old man who would like to have at least some political integrity amongst our leaders? Or is this just old history? Keep up the good work. Charles. He's running a pretty formidable campaign, Generic, isn't he?
He is. He's got an incredibly clear analysis of the problem and total clarity in his messages as a result. And he's certainly right about immigration.
And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week, it's my turn. And in our wonderful Planet Normal contrary way, I'm going to give email of the week to Jerry, who disagreed with my beloved co-pilot, Alison. But he didn't disrespect her. And that is what counts. Jerry sends us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Put in the subject heading of that email mug winner. Send us your postal address and you'll be sent a rare as rocking horse poo Planet Normal mug.
Can't believe you did that to Alison when she's away. That's a low blow. If you enjoy Planet Normal, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen to this podcast. It helps others to find us so the Planet Normal family can grow.
Indeed. And this is how we roll on Planet Normal, Nick. We're really inclined to give email of the week to people who disagree with us because we are about disagreeing agreeably. That is the rule of law on Planet Normal. And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers, Isabel Bouchard, Elliot Lampitt, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Thank you so much to Nick Timothy, the busy MP for West Suffolk, newly minted. He's barely got an office. What must it be like, given that he once had the best office in Westminster? Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.